Good afternoon. You are in this room because you are interested in plants. This is the plant selection for stormwater management. Few housekeeping things. We have 20 minutes for the presentation from Brandy, followed by 10 minutes for Q&A. We will be recording the presentation itself, but you yourselves will not be recorded for the 10-minute Q&A. Oh, wow, we have a big crowd. Okay. So there's some seats up here. And there's one seat up here, just don't take mine. Okay. So thank you. I'd like to introduce Brandy Reynecke. She is the Department of Ecology's Eastern Regional Municipal Grants and Loans Project Manager. And she's the Water Quality Program's Stormwater Vegetation Specialist. She has a BS in Botany and an MS in Plant Ecology, and some people like to refer to her as the statewide plant diva.
Thanks, Heidi. Hello, Brandy Reynecke here. So she said I am a plant ecologist. I've been working in stormwater now for almost 3 years, so I'm an expert. I was recently designated stormwater vegetation specialist, and I'm kind of working on what does that mean. Prior to stormwater, I did native plant community restoration and habitat restoration, and then I got into water quality monitoring, and that's how I segued into water quality and thus stormwater. So today I'm going to talk about factors to consider when selecting plants for bioretention. I'm going to define bioretention for this talk as bioretention swales or cells that are designed to retain, treat, and infiltrate stormwater that use a designed bioretention soil media, and that use plants that are not turf grass. When selecting plants for bioretention, it's important to consider the ecology of a bioretention system. And, oops, wrong button, sorry. So ecology is a branch of biology that studies natural systems. These systems consist of interactions between and among organisms, as well as those organisms' interactions with their environment. There are many, many subdisciplines of ecology. This talk focuses on the ecology of plants and the bioretention systems. Plants interact with and are influenced by many factors, including each other and their environment. They're influenced in a number of ways. For example, soil microbial constituents can affect how plants tolerate external stressors. The picture on the left describes generally how microbial communities will help their host species tolerate stressors like drought, salinity, pathogens, and they can also help the host species can help other plants tolerate those stressors as well. The picture on the right here is just a real general description of how a plant species will be affected differently depending on if it's in a forested environment or in an urban environment. So when we discuss plants, we use a few terms that I have found sometimes cause confusion. Some of the terms that you've all probably heard before but may have different definitions of. I've had conversations with some stormwater managers that said I don't even pay attention to if a plant is native or not, because what the heck does that even mean? So when plant ecologists talk about native plants, they're talking about plants that existed in the area prior to settlement by British and European immigrants. The area can vary drastically. So this is an example of a native species. This is the USDA plants database. This species is Rocky Mountain aster, which is here. Its scientific name is up here. The database says this plant is native to British Columbia, Washington, Idaho, and Montana. But it doesn't specify which regions within this big area this plant is native. You want to make sure that when you're selecting native plants that they're native to your specific region and that they are adapted to a habitat that is similar to the habitat you'd find within a bioretention cell. This is the same plant, the Rocky Mountain aster, but on the Burke Museum's database. So this is a University of Washington establishment, and they specify within Washington, the Rocky Mountain aster is only recorded as being found in Spokane, Stevens, and Pend Oreille counties. So somebody over on the west side here probably isn't going to want to select the Rocky Mountain aster as a native constituent in their planting. They also include habitat information, which you can't read. It says open hillsides and forest openings, moderate to fairly high elevations in the mountains. So if that's not similar to the habitat that your bioretention is going to be emulating, probably not a good selection. So in contrast to native species, there are non-native species. Non-native species are often brought in as garden plants because they're pretty, or for forage for livestock, or for bank stabilization. These non-native plants can escape and become naturalized, which means they are self-perpetuating. They can continue their population without any cultivation. Non-native plants are also called exotic or alien. Some people say non-native is synonymous with invasive, though there are some plants that will escape cultivation that are not necessarily invasive, and I'm going to define invasive on the next slide. This plant is Lunaria annua, and it was brought in as a garden plant because it has these really pretty purple flowers and really cool seed pods. And it does escape, and it can be invasive in disturbed areas within the urban environment, but in eastern Washington anyway, it hasn't gone into the wildlands. So an invasive species is somewhat relative, but it's loosely defined as a non-native species that can cause economic or environmental harm. They're often regulated by weed control boards, and they have several classifications. Noxious species is another name that they give these things. There are many different classifications denoting how noxious they are. This is a picture of spotted knapweed, which is a Class A noxious weed over on the east side and perhaps here as well. Then there are also cultivars and ornamentals. Sometimes they're specifically used in just landscape and for garden. They can escape and become weedy or invasive, but they're often used just in landscape situations. Those are the plant terms that I'm going to be using. And shifting gears a little, I'm going to talk about some of the environmental factors that affect plant health and survival in bioretention cells. And this talk focuses just on the 4 important factors for plant health and survival. So this is not a water quality talk, this is a plant health and survival talk. So the first factor is soil moisture. Soil moisture is vitally important. If functioning properly, a bioretention swale will be periodically inundated during storm events or immediately after storm events, and then they're going to be dry. So it's cyclic flooding and drought. And the flooding is only going to occur in the ponding area. So you want to make sure that the plants that you're selecting for your ponding area can handle the inundation, periodic inundation and drought. As you go up the side of a swale, though, they're not going to be getting the inundation, so you can sort of grade your plants. This is a bioretention cell. Its entire planting area is the ponding area, so you really only need to focus on those plants that can handle the inundation. In a swale, this is a picture of a swale in Walla Walla, and you can see here they put rushes in the ponding area, and then here we'll probably get wet but not inundated. They have daylilies. And then up here on the top of the slope where it's going to mostly be very dry, they have a drought-tolerant creeping juniper. The next factor is soil composition. So the standard BSM mix, or bioretention soil media mix in Washington, is the 60-40 mix. It's very similar to sandy loam. So you want to make sure that you're selecting plant species that are adapted for sandy loam or silty loam soil. It's also important to consider the adjacent land use. If the soil is in a heavily landscaped area, it may receive excessive nutrients, pesticides, and that can have a big effect on how the plants grow and thrive. And in areas where there is a lot of road salt being used, the salt can concentrate in the soil, increase the alkalinity, so you want to look for plants that can handle that salt loading. Another factor is temperature and light. Plants have a range of temperatures that they can withstand. There are hardiness zones and heat stress zones that you can find online, but you really need to pay attention to the microclimate, the climate of your specific facility. In areas or in swales that are going to be surrounded by asphalt or concrete, have buildings all around them, they're probably going to be a higher heat range than something in a more natural area. So you really want to know what the highs and the lows of your specific site are going to be, and look more specifically at your site versus just in general your hardiness zone. Shade is also important. In swales where trees are planted, those trees are going to grow. So you want to choose plants that are well adapted for both sun and shade, so you don't have to go back through and replant shade-tolerant plants. And in areas where there's not any shade, and there probably never will be, full sun plants are the best. Where the facility is located in the landscape is also important. The south-facing side of a building is going to get a lot more full sun, probably going to be a lot hotter versus a north-facing slope or north swale on the north side of a building. It's going to get more shade. And so the shade affects both light and temperature and soil moisture. These things all kind of work in conjunction. Artificial light is a factor that I have not seen considered prior to doing this talk. And some plants are really sensitive to artificial light at night. They call it Allen. This is an example of actually a native species to Washington, Ruse glabra, or it's a sumac. And here's the artificial light. And here, the leaves aren't changing colors. That can be a problem because plants who lose their foliage, they do it so that they don't sustain snow and ice damage. And if you have leaves hanging on for a longer period of time, you're more likely that those plants are going to be damaged by snow and ice. Also, artificial light can increase leaf size and make it so that the stomata that are used for gas exchange stay open longer. It makes them more susceptible to pollution. In preparing for this, was doing some research, and I found some plant lists that actually show plants that are susceptible to light, plants that are moderately susceptible to light, and plants that aren't. They aren't specific to Washington, but I think there could be eventually a list for Washington. Disturbance is a factor that's important to consider. If you're in a heavily built environment, deer and rabbits and bulls are probably not going to be as important to consider, but if you're in more of the rural-urban interface or in a more residential area, deer can be really hard on plants. The Country Homes Boulevard talk, I don't know if any of you saw that, bulls are a serious problem. And of course, anything that likes to munch on the plants or pests. Snow storage. Typically, you don't want to store snow in bioretention swales, but sometimes it's unavoidable and you have to do it. And if you know ahead of time that your swales are going to be used for snow storage, you want to select plants that are well adapted for that kind of a weight load. You don't want to use really brittle woody species because they'll just break down and you could potentially kill them. Grasses, perennial forbs, so forbs are just leafy, like the green plants that aren't woody. I don't have a better way of explaining that right now. Sometimes they'll die off during the winter. A native species on the east side is the balsam, arrowleaf balsam root. They're awesome, beautiful plants, and they completely go away by winter. So you don't have to worry about killing them with snow load. Maintenance is also a really important factor to consider. When you're developing a planting list, you want to make sure that you know who's going to be maintaining your plantings and that they are capable of maintaining those plantings. For example, the city of Walla Walla, which I don't have a picture of here, their parks department is going to maintain their swales. But the maintenance crews did not know the difference between plants that were put there on purpose and plants that they needed to remove. So they ended up pulling a ton of plants that were supposed to be there. That's expensive and frustrating. Also, they didn't realize that sedges and rushes are not to be weed whacked. So they ended up killing a bunch of those as well. This is a swale, a bioretention swale in Pullman that had a great plants list. The Parks Department was going to be maintaining this planting, but apparently the Parks Department did not know this. So when they saw the plants list and they were told they were going to be maintaining this, they said, nope, we're not going to do that. So there are no plants in this swale, and this is now a media filter with some plants around the top. And this is just an example I found on the internet. It's in Clark County. It's a bioretention swale that's been completely invaded by blackberry. So not being maintained and likely not functioning all that well. So to recap, choose plants that are adapted for the climate of your specific facility, not your region in general. And consider all soil moisture, soil conditions, soil composition. Make sure the plants that you're selecting are adapted for those soil conditions. Consider your surrounding land use. Consider light, temperature, shade, including artificial light, and consider all the different kinds of disturbance that your soils might be encountering. And, as part of my vegetation specialist role, a big part of what I'm trying to do is get information from you guys. Talks like these, what do you want to hear more of? What things are confusing to you? Share with me your challenges. Send me pictures so I can share those challenges with others. And I would like to eventually develop a tool to help stormwater managers and consultants and contractors more easily develop plant lists that are appropriate for their specific sites. I'd like to take the need to know everything about plants out of the plant selection process, if possible, for people who don't want to or just don't know. So that's everything I have.